welcome. I'm Don Mallory. This is Adventures in Data Labeling. This is the short version, so I'm probably going to speak very quickly because the original talk was like 48 slides, and we can't do that in 25 minutes. So, who am I? I've worked over 30 years in IT, primarily in critical infrastructure, mostly with a security focus. Today, I'm working as a healthcare security professional in a large hospital service that you probably have heard of that I won't name in this particular setting, but talk to me afterwards if you'd like to know. If certs are your thing, I have some to my credit. I've helped build, mentor, and run a variety of InfoSec programs over the years. Hack for Kids Toronto, which was done in 2019, for example, and hopefully we'll bring that back sometime in the future. But I also teach black and white darkroom techniques because sometimes we need things that aren't the same as the technology we use during the day. These are about my experiences. These are my adventures. If you've had different experiences with some of this tooling or some of these things, please share them. Come up, talk to me afterwards, talk to other people around you afterwards. This is how we learn. So I've done this talk 2 times before. The talk was done in a very small group, and the very first thing that I learned was something that I had not even considered. And the second time, somebody brought something up else that nobody in the room had considered. And in the process of that, we all learned something. This is where I've come to. This is what I've touched. You'll touch different things. We all need to learn this stuff together because what the vendors are doing out there is they want you to pay for professional services to do this stuff. And frankly, we can all do it ourselves. We just actually have to have those conversations. So standard disclaimer, the thoughts and opinions as we go through this presentation are mine and mine alone. They are not those of my past, present, or future employers. Let's go through an agenda. So there's no need to take photos as we go through this presentation. All of the references will be shared at the end. The GitHub is actually not populated quite yet, but the QR code will work. The QR code at the end is the right QR code to use. Feel free to play along with the game throughout the presentation. There will be awards for the winners. And as we go through this, we're going to be going through a general overview. We're going to cover a data asset inventory. We will go through some labeling models. We're going to tie this back to the implementation of the services and how you would implement data labeling models within organizations. And then we're going to tie that back to technology. We're going to get into sensitivity labels, retention labels, information asset protection scanning. And then we're also going to tie that in with data loss prevention at the end. And that's part of the reason why I'm talking quickly, because there's a lot here. But as you can see, the path ahead is not quite clear, but we will get there. So some assumptions. There's no such... Excellent! You are the winner. You get the duck. Treat this duck as tapped. This is the CSE duck. Thank you very much for playing. Anyways, there is no one size fits all. What happens in your organization and what works for your organization is not what's worked in the organizations that I've worked in or the spaces that I've built or been involved in deploying this in my career. This doesn't have to be perfect because it's an iterative process. It's not a one and done. This is something that you'll do throughout a long period of time. You don't have to cover everything because you are always going to have to embrace the rate of change. Things are going to change as you go through, as the interfaces will change as you go through this, and they'll change so quickly that you won't actually see it coming. Microsoft puts in somewhere between 300 and 600 changes to their security interface a year. That's in addition to their compliance interfaces and all of the other interfaces as you walk through these tool sets. Pricing is between you and your sales reps. This is going to take as long as it takes to implement and not less. That's going to be a discussion that you have with your stakeholders. It's not just your change advisory board. This is bigger than just your change advisory board and the IT initiatives. So what is this not? Data labeling is not ransomware protection. Scanning your data, identifying your data, labeling your data, putting in encryption, this is not going to solve ransomware protection. That's a completely different talk. But Then we need to talk about AI. There's a talk coming up soon about AI, and I've seen that talk, or at least the longer version of it, and it's phenomenal. So I look forward to seeing it again. But the thing to note in particular is that there are no AI magical unicorns that are going to solve these problems for you. This stuff, when you're talking especially about the use of AI and machine learning models to tie it back to data, humans label data exactly the opposite wrong way than AI does. So this is good. These are tools that can help you identify where your data is in ways that you weren't thinking. But that doesn't necessarily solve the problem of let's just replace all the humans with AI because they're doing the wrong things the opposite way than we are. So the other thing to keep in mind is this stuff isn't free. Whether it's the software licensing or your time, which is actually the thing you need to be more cognizant of, there's always a cost to implementing this stuff. So what is data labeling? My kids love journals. They love to write everything that's important to them in those journals, and then they mark them as top secret so that everyone knows how important those journals are and that nobody should be looking at them. And then they grew up and they got Instagram. And then they thought, okay, well, we're going to just share everything that we think is public with the whole world around us. So more recently, we've started doing our taxes. Now, the fact is there's other people that decide how long I have to retain things when I'm doing my taxes. And for example, if, say, you have a contract with an organization that says that you're going to have a third party do your taxes, and that organization messes up your taxes, and then you get audited for the next 5 years as a result, which happened to me, and I'll name that company when I'm not on being recorded, then you end up having to have a good reason for why you need to keep those because someone else made that decision for you, and there are consequences to not keeping that data. Now, where is that data now? Well, that data isn't necessary anymore because it's well beyond that 7-year retention requirement, and I've deleted it because I don't want to keep any data that may be a waste or something that I don't want to keep around or don't want to be responsible for. So we classify things throughout our lives as we go throughout our days, every single day. When someone says to you, well, why do you want to put data classification in? Ask them which folder they put their mail into because they just classified their data. They're doing it every day. So why do we label our data? You need to ask questions about, you need to ask yourself questions about your data. Why is it important to you? Is there going to be impact or injury to the data, to having the data lost or stolen at any point in time? There are 3 things that help people make decisions. You lose your job, you lose your house, or you end up in an orange jumpsuit. These things are covered by legal and regulatory requirements. So when we're thinking about this data, you need to think about how are you going to store the data? What type of auditing requirements need to be in place for that data? Do you have any special tools or retention of those logs? How long do you have to keep it for? Where should you be keeping it? Should you be keeping it at all? Is there a freedom of information requirement or an e-discovery risk to having that data? Or do you need to have a reason to disclose it? If it's lost or stolen, who do you tell? If you're looking at the CIS Top 20 or any of the other frameworks, you'll notice that they all have a requirement for some form of inventorying tools. They always focus on software and hardware, but frankly, they're starting to move towards data, primarily because of the fact that we've all moved our data into these cloud infrastructures, which makes perfect sense at this point in time. But that also means that we need to move away from having or expecting that our data is going to be protected by the firewalls, by identity protection, by all of these other things before that, and we need to start moving those controls closer to the data. The fact is all of those other things, the network, the firewall, the IDS, your MFA methods, all of that other stuff, that's either an access method or it's the user, not the data. So what is a data asset inventory? It's a literal inventory. Someone has to go out and talk to your users and find out what they're actually doing. What are they using their data for? What are they storing? Why are they storing it? How are they storing it? How are they working with it? What does that mean? Where does it go? What are you going to do with it? Someone physically has to actually talk to these people, figure out what those business processes are, what they're tied to. And that's going to drive the type of information that you're going to gather about your data. And it's also going to tie it back to those regulatory requirements that you can look up. They're all available on various different government websites, but really this comes back to data lifecycle management. You're going to use that as an input. So when you start looking at data from a sensitivity perspective, governments have been labeling data for sensitivity for a very long time, and most of the sensitivity models that we use for labeling data are based on things that we've tied to either a government or a regulatory body in some fashion or other. Each of these models have different purposes, different impacts, and different risks. And when you consider how data is labeled, you have to think about them in terms of an injury test. How much damage will be done to your organization if the data is lost or stolen or whatever it happens to be? And they use terms like grave damage, critical damage, serious damage, mortal damage. But when they're discussing these things, but really when it comes right down to it, it's really about, how should you be treating this data? Sorry, not the damage. So what about some other alternative models? Well, there's some models that tie back to data subject rights, or they tie back to specific regulatory requirements. That might make sense for you. But if you looked at the previous model that we had, even the one for healthcare, I work in healthcare, there's 5 labels for the standard model in healthcare. If I add those 5 to these, now I'm at 14. That's a lot of labels. If you have to have a flowchart for how you're going to access and look at data labeling, you're doing it wrong. So, labeling for retention. So most people believe they should keep everything. It comes down to risk, right? So it comes down to the risk of whether or not you need to keep something versus should you keep something. Some people feel like they have to keep something forever. Frankly, they don't. Most people don't really need to keep stuff forever. And when it comes down to the understanding retention is driven primarily by legal and regulatory requirements. One helpful resource is linked here at the bottom and in the slides, which comes from the Ontario Hospital Association. It's a giant spreadsheet of every single way that you could possibly think of for why you would want to store or retain data. Now, if you're looking at things in terms of hospitals most people think of are, patients, we've got these services, you have to keep stuff related to patients. Well, we also run these great big huge government buildings. And in my org, we do power cogeneration and all sorts of other stuff. So like NERC SIP applies and all sorts of other stuff. There's lots of different reasons that you might want to retain data. This is a great guide for getting you there as to figuring out what those are. But just a show of hands, who thinks that retaining the data is actually the problem? Like that, making sure that you have the right amount of the data for the right time. The problem isn't retaining the data. It's how the heck are you going to be able to read it? And what are you going to do with it in 150 years? Because that 150 years, that's real. So we need to talk about stakeholders. The first time that I was introduced to the concept of data labeling, the organization I was with, the CEO came down and he did a presentation on why are we doing this? What are we doing? How are we doing it? And most importantly, how are you going to do it? And where do you get information about it? It made sure that we understood that the CEO was behind the initiative from the very beginning. When you have a CEO that's standing behind an initiative from day one, you know that it's got legs, that it's important, that it actually means something to the organization. That's your stakeholder. That's the one that you want involved. If you can't get that stakeholder, find someone as high an executive position as possible. If you do not have a stakeholder that is in a position to drive it forward across the organization, you will not succeed. So when we talk about implementing data labeling, now that you've got a sponsor, you need a policy. eHealth Ontario did a whole bunch of really great work to put together free draft policies everybody is allowed to have a copy of. You can Google them, look for eHealth Ontario and Standard, and you'll find all of their policies that are available for public access. It's a great draft to start with, but it needs to cover all of your data in all locations and all forms. This also means that it also has to cover how you're going to handle the data throughout its life cycle, what types of controls you're going to put in place, and how you're going to declassify it when you're done. But what do you do next? Well, you need a comms plan. You need your PR team involved. They have to be involved throughout that process. You need to ensure that there's mandatory e-learning in place as you go through and expand it out to users. Nothing beats a quick reference card that's been deployed to every single user's desk as something to refer to. And then you need to go in and start looking at tech. Now, as you look at the tech, one of the things you're going to have to think about is, what about printers? And there's an easy solution. Get stamps. You think I'm kidding, but I'm really not. The best tool and most effective engagement method that I've ever seen was that they had stamps at every single printer that literally said official use only, protected A, protected B, secret, top secret, whatever it happened to be. And the extended piece of that was that if you found a document on a printer that wasn't labeled and you got it to a director, they'd trade it for a Tim Hortons gift card. You have no idea how many Tim Hortons gift cards I won. It was so much fun, but it worked. And but the reason that you have to worry about unlabeled documents is really important. Unlabeled documents, any document, when you are labeling all of your data, any unlabeled document is public or unclassified. So when your HR department decides to print out a copy of the entire pension repository and they leave it on the printer and then it accidentally gets dropped in the parking lot and somebody picks it up, that's fair game for the front page of the news. And most news agencies will just look at it and go, yeah, cool. Whereas many news agencies, if they see, privileged and confidential or something, they might be like, whoa, hey, we're going to get a really, really big bonus for this one. But they might also actually make a phone call and make sure that it's not going to harm someone before they do that. It depends on the news agency, though. So some implementation challenges. Nothing you ever do is simple and challenge-free. If you forgot your asset inventory, well, you're going to have a hard time figuring out where your stuff is so that you can actually get moving. If you've missed your executive sponsor, well, good luck with that. Your policy got stuck in review cycles and never got published. Bad or missing examples in the examples that you're putting into that policy. Well, if nobody knows how they're supposed to be labeling something or what they're supposed to label, it's going to be hard for them to do that. If you forget your education materials are not mandatory, then nobody's going to read them, and you'll be in a position to make sure that nobody's actually paying attention whatsoever, and then nobody will know what they're doing, and then you'll be back to all of these things are in the wrong spots. Do not exceed 5 labels. I'm quite serious about this. If you need a flow diagram to figure out, like that flow diagram I showed you earlier with the great big chart and which directions things are going, if you have a flow diagram to tell people how to label data, they're going to be confused and you're doing it wrong. Everybody hates watermarking. They all hate watermarking. Everyone does. They don't like it at the top. They don't like it at the bottom. They don't like it diagonal. They don't like it in the middle. They don't like the color. They don't like the font. Whatever it happens to be, they don't like watermarking. And the reason that they don't like watermarking is because they see it as unsightly. So you can be forced to turn that off, and sometimes you are. But remember that as soon as you do that, then the document that's unlabeled is public. But the other thing is that most often, most people actually just get used to it. It just becomes part of the problem or part of the infrastructure. And those unlabeled documents, that's where DLP starts to come in. So implementing the business side was easy, right? Everybody with me so far? Because we got 10 minutes left and we're going to race through the rest of it. Okay, so Microsoft Purview, the all-seeing eye of Purview, because that's not the creepiest logo that you've ever seen. Like everything in Microsoft 365, there's always a new portal. The portal is brand spanking new. It covers data governance, risk and compliance, and data security pillars. It's got lots of tools in there. It's really hard to find things. It's really sluggish, and it changes almost daily. We're going to dig in specifically to the information protection, data lifecycle management, and data loss prevention sections. Sensitivity labels. So before you start doing anything with sensitivity labels, make sure that you apply, and you're planning on applying them to SharePoint and M365 groups. You need to there's a PowerShell command that you need to apply that ensures that the labels are pushed into Entra. If you do not do this, they will not show up. It takes days for it to happen. And then you'll have to try and figure out how you're going to do that after the fact, which is kind of annoying. If you don't enable co-authoring at the beginning, for co-authoring of documents with sensitivity labels on them, then you will find that all of the data and the documents have to be relabeled and all of the users have to be reconnected to be able to do that, and it's not fun. Don't. Labeling in Teams requires premium licensing, so consider that. So you remember we worked on a plan with our stakeholders. We're going to turn that into reality. You need to make sure that you plan carefully. You can't delete a label. So if you name it wrong, you can't the other way around. You can't rename a label. You can delete a label, you can't rename them. If you create a label incorrectly, like you spelled, health wrong, you put the T and the L backwards because like that happens, then you'll find that you go and delete that label and all of the data that was labeled with that previous label is no longer accessible until you apply a new label to it. Please, whatever you do not delete a label. 15 characters is generally the limit because while you can do longer, most of the interfaces don't actually include the display very well, and it doesn't work out very well. What else we got? Order them from least restrictive to most restrictive, and ensure you scope everything that you can. Content marking is global. However, I did just learn as part of a previous discussion that it is possible for you to narrow down the positioning of those labels with a series of really oddly deployed PowerShell scripts. So that was an interesting learning. But think about how you read email, for example. If you put the label at the bottom, the label really only applies to the things after the label, right? So if you're reading it from the top and it says, protected sensitive up the top, and then you get to the bottom and it says, top secret, and you're like, oh, well, that only the part at the bottom is top secret, right? Generally, you want to apply and ensure that the labels are, the most restrictive label always applies to all the content. So if there's anything that can inherit labels, you want to make sure that that's applied, and I think that's actually part of a different slide. What else we got? Content marking. Access controls, I think we're in there. With the access controls, you want to make sure that you allow the users to choose the right labels that they want to apply, and the controls that they're going to apply to the labels, let that to be user selectable. And then when you're talking about external users, you can also control some of those functions as well. Okay. We don't need that. So generally, that's what it looks like once you've created some labels. Now you've got them. Now you need to publish them. And we're skipping that. Okay. So once you publish your labels, you'll publish them to all of your users. Make sure that you require that the users are going to apply a label, and regardless, set a default label. Set that default label to internal. If you set it too high, then you've overclassified data that you don't need to. If you set it too low, like public, then you've underclassified everything. The problem is that you don't want to have too many restrictive controls on things you don't necessarily want, and friction on things that you don't want to have overlabeled, but you also don't want to expose them to easy access or risk. When users are users should be allowed to reduce the label at any point in time. However, they need to ensure that they record why they're doing that. When you do that, you'll find that there's an audit log that ends up in your audit records. So you'll actually know when somebody goes and decides to drop the label to public from internal, and what the file name was and where it was located and all those other things. By the way, that's entirely doctored and that's actually not real. 5 minutes. Okay. So retention, we talked about all the sensitivity stuff. You start with retention policies. These are your defaults. You'll apply these to everything. You want to make sure that these apply as the minimum requirements for what you're going to do for your organization. Retention policies need to tie back to your regulatory requirements. Bet you didn't know you were running a Yammer instance, and you probably want to delete those. But you also want to think about what you want to wipe out on purpose. When you start looking at retention labels, those are actually not visible to your users except through the OneDrive interface, and it's really, really frustrating. But you want to make sure that those are available so that you can use them for auto-labeling and auto-classification, which gets into sensitivity, sensitive info types, trainable classifiers, and regex, exact data match. Sensitive info types are basically regex, and you're applying them to stuff. Sometimes they're okay, mostly they're not, but you can tune them to be better matched. Trainable classifiers are important because you can actually train them on your data. Auto-labeling for retention and data sensitivity You use those other things, the sensitive info types, trainable classifiers, which is the machine learning models, and the exact data match to apply either a retention label, which is the best way to do it, or a sensitivity label. The sensitivity labels is really helpful because when you tie that back to your information asset protection scanner, which will scan through all of your on-premises stuff in SharePoint and SMB shares, noting that you need a SQL server and an account with access to everything, it gives you an ugly-ass spreadsheet that you can go through and see what the content looks like and where it is all throughout your environment. But that is going to help you at least identify where your stuff is. You'll tie that back to data loss prevention. So you see how these are all rolled together. Your sensitive information types, your trainable classifiers, your sensitivity labels, your retention labels, these all tie back together into data loss prevention. And this is where you're going to apply controls to make sure that people are doing the things that you expect them to do in the ways that you're expecting them to run. And where they're expected to go. Some things, credential matches in particular, are really, really accurate and sensitive info types, but the generic passwords and any of the generic keys, they don't work at all. Whatever you do, don't use those. Which takes us to when you are using data loss prevention, make sure don't bother with a picture because it's in the link in the GitHub. If you do use data loss prevention rules, make sure that you scope things properly because you'll notice that this is all Exchange Online and this is all the other stuff. So if you decide you want to include Exchange Online, Teams, and OneDrive, you've now got it down to like 3 things that it's actually going to select on, and the rest of it is completely a waste of time because you've now just dropped all of those selectors off your list of things you can use. That's pretty much what it looks like once you put some policies together. And we're going to skip right past that. So what do you do when you're talking about the actual policies themselves? We're going to adjust our data as we start looking at the prevention policies. We want to make sure that we're tweaking the data that is known sensitive with labels. We're going to tie that stuff back to allow certain things like T4 slips to go home or the employee discount can book because for some reason Canada's Wonderland is so important that they have to have a username and password to get discounts. You're going to then nudge users by giving them a reminder that they're about to do something that's not good for them or good for the organization, and then you're going to block things that are tied back to those regulatory controls or the 3 magic things that you don't want to have happen to your organization. So we're going to rip through the limitations and frustrations really quickly because there's a lot of them, and basically a lot of this stuff doesn't work the way that you expect, but there are ways for you to work through them. Feel free to refer back to the slides. What could go wrong? Well, everything. That's what it looks like on the bottom right. When you do it wrong, there's 11 labels in there, and they're buried in multiple layers. That's what it looks like when you do it right. It's straightforward. People can see where it is. There's an info link that ties back to your educational materials. It's right in people's face. Licensing. E3 pretty much covers all of it. F5 covers the rest of it. Or sorry, E5 covers the rest of it. And there's always more, right? So some quick conclusions. When I started pitching this concept, everybody thought it was an intractable problem and that we couldn't do it. The fact is they were right. But that's the thing about security. It's not the easy things that have the most impact and the things that that have the most impact in our organizations. It's the things that we take the time to build that have the most impact as we educate our stakeholders and discuss those risks and impacts to the organization. Deploying the technology was easy, but you have to have a plan to make sure that you actually deploy this out to your organization in a timely fashion. And the education materials are the most important. Understanding the requirements before you apply the technology is wonderful and very, very satisfying, but it's also really awesome when you finally get that first DLP alert that somebody calls you back and says, whoa, hey, wait a minute, I didn't know that file actually contained a SIN number that I accidentally sent out because I thought it was a blank template. And then you're like, wow, a security thing actually got a positive phone call from somebody in a team out in the field. Being able to simulate things has a really large impact on success. And making sure that you're nudging your users has a really positive impact on making sure that you change the behaviors and helps you out in the event that you actually get to the point where you're in a breach situation. So lots of resources and links. You don't have to take a picture. That's all that's going to be shared. I'm going to click right through it. We don't have time for questions. This is the real QR code. And thank you again for playing.
That was great. Thank you, Don. And in fact, if you don't mind staying for one or two questions while we get Ian down here and set up.
No worries.
Come on. Oh, okay. You have a question?
Go for it.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, you're going to have to speak up. Yes. So the question is the expectation that the end users are going to classify their data? Yes, the end users are going to classify their data. You select a default so that everything gets labeled, because anything that's not labeled is public, so you want to make sure that there's a label assigned to everything. And then you want to use auto-labeling policies that tie back to anything that's not labeled properly. But keep in mind that as you're doing this, you want the users to be able to correct that label. You don't want to force it on them, with the exception that if you have regulated content that absolutely needs to be a certain way, make sure that that is treated that way. So SIN numbers, personal health information, if you have a classifier that works for that, make sure that that stuff is actually labeled as PHI or PII or confidential, where in credentials restricted. Don't let people share those credentials through open